Hey everybody, this is Kara CrossFit Brindle, and
Jim Thomas. Hi.
hi, we're back again. I haven't seen Jim in quite a while, so this is very fun to jump on a video together. We were talking off recording about what we wanted to talk about, and what showed up was self-a-therapist and authenticity and this balancing act between being ourselves with self-disclosure, and then of course being moral, ethical, and professional. So, fun backstory: when I first met Jim, I went and did in one of his EFT intensives, 3 day training, just because I was curious. I wasn't even doing couples work at the time. I was just like, I've heard good things. I'm gonna go. And what I remember most is Jim, because you were
Mm.
authentic, you were charismatic, you were engaged, and I loved it. So I really do feel like I'm talking to the right person when it comes to authenticity and self a therapist. So thanks for jumping on a video with me.
Oh, thanks. That's nice compliment. I remember very young, actually talking to a friend who just called me right before our talk, Mark, who's I've been friends with since like third grade. And I think we were 12 or 13 years old in West Lafayette, Indiana. And I was saying to Mark, and he remembers this conversation, we're shooting baskets. And I said, Mark, how do we know who we really are?
Mm.
How do I know who's Jim and how much of who I am is because I was born in the time I'm living in? Um, how much of who I am, um, like the color of my skin? I grew
Mm.
up listening to like Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement. So I'm like, how is it different to be white skinned and black or brown or and how much is that were at that time I would have said boys were young, girls and all these things that like we think to ourselves and we choose to be this person, but how many influences, right? And then I get into, I think, early college and I discover this book by Alan Watts on the taboo against knowing who you are.
No.
It's a really powerful read for a young person about stop and think about what did you choose and what's sort of told to you by society. I think about like ways we do therapy. I was on a Facebook page recently, and somebody put up their new office. They're in practicum, and it's very
Mhm.
clear to me like this is an expression of self and something they'd be very comfortable with, and it's got bold qualities to it. And you could watch the sort of bifurcation of responses of some people saying "good for you," and other people saying like, "Wow, that's pretty intense." And I like I have wood paneling. If I showed you the whole office, my clinical office, I don't have a desk in it. And I'm
Mhm.
sending a message about it's kind of welcome to like a sort of like my living room that
Right.
mi casa su casa, my office can be your home away from home. And I invite people to come for 2 or 3 days. That's my practice right now. But I
Right.
was doing that beforehand. I have tea and coffee and snacks that say, welcome, I want to know you. And then I read the Erroneous Zones by this Wayne Dyer back in the day, who really sort of, I think now we'd use the word like deconstructs
Mm.
what society is saying we ought to be and trying to find a deeper sort of inner truth or a calling, a North Star, or virtues we want to aspire to, or a contribution we want to make. And as I came into the therapy world, I was really attracted at first to Carl Rogers. And if you go back and read Rogers, there's a lot of talk about, which I think is really essential, about being as emotionally present and engaged and feeling what you're feeling too as therapists that I believe is at the core of. So when you say, oh, you're authentic, you showed up as yourself, it's Rogers had that notion of, there's a public and a private self, like a Venn diagram. And the
Mhm.
more they overlap, sort of the more ease there is in life. It matches some of the research that indicates like transparent people that kind of let you know who they are. I'm not talking about just somebody that's harsh with their opinion or something, but
Right. I think that's a distinction of like people who like, oh, I'm going to name this, but it actually gives them like the excuse to be mean or harsh versus like, this is who I am. I have no filter, like that kind of language.
yeah, because it's
Um,
transparency about me and my experience, not
right.
I'm going to transparently attack you.
Yeah, it's an excuse almost. So I appreciate you naming that. What I'm seeing in my head, Jim, is like kind of like ripple rings, right? Of like, here's me, the core, like whatever me is, however we define that, values, spirituality, essence. And then there's kind of these other factors that kind of surround us, whether it's community, spiritual practice,
Mm.
professional passions. I don't know. So I guess what
Yeah.
are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I'm getting to it's sort of as you said that I don't. It's hard to know what even in what I believe is at my core is at my core, or did I inherit it, from the
Mm,
system I grew up in? So I look for, um, so when I'm with couples, that's mostly what I do in intensive, some families, some individuals. I look for feedback about, we really feel comfortable with you. We could feel like you're really here. We can
mhm,
tell you're having an emotional experience with us. I'm looking for feedback from my clients about the way in which I'm showing up. And then I'm seeking this congruence that Rogers talked about. And I think now we use the word authenticity, this
mhm,
more authentic expression of self in this unique way, I might say strange way, in which whatever self is Jim, or Jim and my relationship with my life partner, Patrice, which is a huge part of who I am, or
mhm,
Jim and my friendship with Mark, who was on the phone, that also is a part of me. Like, there's so many people inside of me that when we individualize it, it starts to fall apart for me. I think so. I want to take what you're saying about ripples. I think it goes back and forth. It's this
mhm,
like, you know, feedback in and feedback out, and that I am in so many ways the sum total of my relational experiences, and I am
mhm,
this unique person with the name Jim Thomas, born in this time. But for me personally, I like and embrace that. For example, like if I think about my wife now, I think about a Karen Drucker song in which she says, "We are connected by the heart. Where do you end? Where do I start? You're a part of me. I'm a part of you. So whatever you feel, I feel too. So your pain is my pain. Your joys are my pains. Your prayers are my prayers. And I experience life in significant and subtle ways differently than she does. So it's this, there's an us and there's a me and there's a her.
mhm,
And I find that when I'm working with clients, the letting go and allowing an us to be happening, whether it's an individual, a group, a family, a couple, that while you're with me and I'm with you, we are having a relationship. And
mhm.
I'm either serving or not other relationships in your life. So it
Mhm.
brings me, you met me through emotionally focused therapy externship. I'm avid. I love emotionally focused therapy. I give thanks to Sue for both the model and for recognizing me.
Mm.
So there it is, another relational thing. Sue saw something in me. You ought to be a trainer. I ended up going around the world training because Sue
Yeah,
Johnson met me and believed in me. That
amazing.
um, relational beings. So to think about use of self as a therapist, I start to even struggle now with that word self.
Mm.
I think it's a reflection of such an individualist culture we live in. That some,
Very
from
possible.
social criticism would talk about all sorts of aspects of individualist culture that tend to benefit those with privilege and comfort, in which
Mm.
it's easier for me to be a self in this culture, and I can't recognize it. For you, it's more complicated, difficult, painful, oppressive, marginalized, shunned, scolded. Let's try to shape you to make me come. So I'm sort of,
Yeah. I
how do
actually
I?
appreciate this perspective of like self might not be what we're actually aiming for because I'm kind of hearing in my head my students who might be like, okay, this sounds good, but I'm having some resistance to the vulnerability of showing up fully or of creating relationships with my clients where is it now a blurred boundary of my professionalism with them. Can you speak to any of that, of like that fear that comes
Yes.
up for folks?
Well, I'd say to your students. So let's say if you're showing this in class, Yes, it's vulnerable. Yes, it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable
Yeah,
for me.
period.
It's been vulnerable for me from beginning. It's been vulnerable. It's vulnerable to share things even with, let's say, my wife or Mark or some other friend.
Mm,
To be fully present, it's in a way, it's a way of viewing therapy that matches a beautiful Khalil Gibran quote where Khalil Gibran says that work is love made visible. And if you go back and read Rogers, I think you could see like Rogers really, in a lot of ways, talking about loving, being a loving, kind, caring person. Fred Rogers, same. He's my favorite humanist of the 20th century, right? Or the General Theory of Love book, where
mm,
they're talking about how can therapy not be a loving activity, and to love is to be vulnerable, to love is to risk hurt or loss. So we can step back but I would ask everyone, where do professional boundaries come from? What's the
mm.
root of professional boundaries? What's the root? When I was talking about offices, like who decided that an office should be a certain way?
Right.
Who decided that this is? So for me, the professional boundaries are pretty clear. Um, Respect confidentiality, avoid dual relationships. If you
Mhm.
start to feel a conflict of interest, pay attention to it. Um, if you're beyond your scope of experience or competence, either go get consultation, get more resources, get knowledge. If that's not sufficient, refer out. Don't have
Right.
sex with your clients or
I was
anything,
waiting for that.
right? That even like, but it's interesting, isn't it? I think it's evolving. But in around 2010, I think I was presenting. I was director of Denver Family Institute. We did a big workshop that I had created about 5 pillars for effective therapy, and based on like psychotherapy outcome research. And I talked about, when you love your clients, and somebody said, well, but what if clients fall in love with you? And I said, well, have you, as in this group of my 100 people, how many of you have been there for a client or a family, a couple through really difficult circumstances? And if you're a student, have you been there for someone? And then everyone's raised their hands. And I said, that person loved you in that moment.
Mm,
The fall in love part comes, I'll really simplify it, but Freudian roots of transference and countertransference and the
right.
sexualization of like the Oedipus complex, which is, I don't, I don't, yeah, that's not the purpose of the talk. But
Right.
those things sit with us. This idea that we're supposed to be sort of objective and sit back and be neutral, but
Yeah.
neutral's a stance.
Yeah. So for students, for example, I mean, obviously we have all sorts of viewers that will probably watch this video, but for people who are like, okay, I'm with you. I hear what you're saying. I want to cultivate more authenticity, more relational connection. What are some ideas you have for them to start that journey if they're not on it already?
Well, what one I think is really important is some sort of congruence between how you want to show up in your life, in relationships as a relational being.
Mm,
We're primarily relational beings with a social brain. We're social mammals, but how you get to define that, and some congruence between that and how you show up in the therapy room. So the way you so lovingly have said you experienced me as a co-leader of an externship,
mhm.
um, is I show up in a similar way in a therapy office. It's different in the sense of like I'm not holding 60 people, let's say, you know,
Right.
their emotional energy. There's I get a certain, like juice from being in front of people. I tend towards extroversion. Um, but I'm wanting to show up with that same. I would want if you saw me or experienced me in therapy, experienced me in training, and you were a guest at my house for dinner. There's a lot of overlap because I'm seeking to be as much Jim as I can.
Mhm.
And if that the threat to doing that is if I show up the way that I want to show up in this world, I'm going to get hurt for it. Or I've been
Right.
hurt in my family for it. I've been impacted. I bring a lot of that. That could be we could talk for 40 minutes about Jim's history. But I would borrow and I could point people to what I love is the person of self in therapy, Harry Aponte's idea. So Aponte is one of the first, the structural family therapists, Mnuchin and Montalvo and Aponte. And in his later career, he started focusing a lot more on person of therapist self. And he talks of this brilliant idea about signature theme or themes in your life and this reframe of where you feel, let's say, the most wounded or the most traumatized, the most vulnerable in your life and relationships is actually can be a gift. And the simplest way I could explain that for me is I very much served in the lost child role in my family. Um,
Mm,
and so I was noticed primarily, particularly when the stress in the family went up before divorce and after divorce. My brother's addiction was kicking in. My dad was pulling back and in his way rationalizing, sort of abandoning my brother and I. My mom's overwhelmed. I got noticed for not needing anything.
mhm.
Well, how's that? As I've explored that in my own personal work, done like adult children of alcoholics, inner child healing, talked about it in so many ways, worked through it in my relationship with like my wife. Um, I am an unabashed, largely uninhibited finder of sort of hidden. Like people come into my office and I'm like, oh gosh, there's a party that's hidden that ought to be seen. And
Mm.
unless
That's
you really
that's your
object,
strength.
I'm coming in. I'm here. I'm not going to back off because I'll stay at the point of contact and then I'll relax. And, I'm not going to intrude. I'm not going to invade. I'm going to invite. I see in there some part of you is lonely. I see in there some part of you was had a trauma when you're very young and you've been alone in it. And look, I happen to have your life partner here. Maybe they could come towards you. So
Yeah.
taking these signature themes and working with them, having a goal of being a whole person, a whole relational self, so that you don't have to put on sort of this professional act and do your impression management work and try to do all the things that all the different grad school supervisors told, don't lean forward in your chair. Why not?
Yeah.
Where,
If that's
who
authentically what
decide?
you want to do, like why not?
Right. You feel like leaning forward. Look at what's happening, and is it leaning forward because you're engaged and you care and uh, lean forward.
Yeah. So if you're in like do your own work, have relations, connections to folks. It sounds like you've also kind of named this. I name it as have people in your life that kind of hold up the mirror to say this is how you're showing up. I think
Hmm?
that's another skill to have someone you trust that won't say it in a harmful way, but like let's say you're not showing up very well or you're suffering in some way, they could be like, hey, this is what you look like right now, or this is how you sound. And then you can adjust. So like maybe in a moment of vulnerability, I'm putting on a professional hat and I'm starting to look more cold and disconnected. And they'd be like, hey, I feel like you're further away from me. You're disconnecting, you're withdrawing. I think that can also be a tool in the toolkit for folks that want to do this work towards being their full selves. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and feedback is so important. Asking clients, the people you're with,
Mm-hmm.
Rogers would say, right, that um, how is this? How is it to be with me? In general, how is it to come to therapy? How is it for me?
Right.
It's like, how is it to sit down and have 2 days to work on this relationship? Are you anxious? Do you feel pressure? How are you? And
Yeah.
then we take a break, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours in, they go to the restroom. I'm asking them when they sit back down, how is this going and what's working, what's not working? Or am I
Yeah.
feeling you? Do you feel like I'm seeing both of you? You let me know if it
Checking
feels like
in.
I'm taking sides. They come back from lunch. How was lunch? Did you talk about our work? Now, I'm not asking for feedback in a sort of, just centralizing myself in the process. I'm
Right.
asking also, how's it to be here and how's it to be together? I'm part of that though, and inviting that feedback like cross culturally. The more differences that are apparent or sort of implicit or um, the more I feel this responsibility. I have a lot of privilege, right? And they're coming to my office, and I have the degrees, and just to be sure that um, is the way I'm showing up working for you.
Yeah.
Uh,
I think that's really important, like you said, to ask for feedback. I know my students are trying to practice that of like, how was the session? Is there anything you'd want me to do differently? And I was talking to them about how there's this fine line between asking for feedback but not making it about you as the person, just being like, what could be different
Mm,
therapists or anything you want to see differently. So it's not like owned by like me. Do you like me? Am I a good
right.
therapist to you?
Yeah.
Um, like I wanted them to make that distinction. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but it was just like, it's not about
Well,
you. It's about their experience.
that's a great question. I believe, and I'm getting to be, I've been doing this 37 years or something, a lot of clinical hours. And I
Mm-hmm.
think there's a high correlation, so for you students, between if they're getting something out of the therapy process, there's a very good chance they also are liking you for the most part. And so if they like you, if they come back after a session and say, I really enjoyed spending time with you, I think you're fun to talk to, or I like your sense of humor, there's a way you are. It's nice that they like you because it fits the research that effective psychotherapy seems to be correlated with some of those things that like go back to Rogers, a
Mm-hmm.
sense of positive regard, warmth, of warmth. I feel some warmth from the therapist towards me, towards my partner, our relationship. There's congruence here. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
Feeling seen, heard, some of those powerful things. Mm-hmm.
so there's paradoxes of this being a therapist. Like if people feel really understood by us and feel empathy from us and that we're walking in their shoes, they're likely to either like or love us or both at somewhat level. Yet our pursuit of that then starts to become more about us. And so I don't want them to feel bad if then in their practicum, gosh, all my clients like me. I must be trying to make my clients like me. Maybe they like you
Mm,
because you're showing up and you're showing up
right,
for them and you're readable.
right. And that's the beauty of having supervision too, is like if they have a worry about how they're showing up, supervisors, instructors, consultants, anyone could probably tell them like, here's what I'm seeing. So this has been an amazing conversation. I know it's probably just the tip of the iceberg on all things under this buzz phrase, as I call it, of self of therapist and how we define that. But is there one final thought you'd have for our viewers when it
But
comes
you had
to just
asked
embracing
about,
that?
you were talking about self-disclosure.
Oh yeah, off record. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you know, I think unfortunately we get a lot of messages about self-disclosure, usually in grad school, early in supervision.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're told about self-disclosure, I think if we stick with the subject about sort of use of self, it's often a reflection of the professor or supervisor's use of self. So if the professor or supervisors are comfortable with and adept at self-disclosure, they may be more likely to encourage it. If they're sort
I
of
could totally see
in,
that.
in the middle, they'll be in the middle. And if they've either seen or were told early on, you just don't self-disclose, it's unprofessional, then you'll get that message. And I believe exploring self-disclosure, and if we're trying to use a more full sense of self, then sometimes our life stories are associations to something like a poem.
Mm-hmm.
Jungians would say, who knows if that association even belongs with you? Could it come from the
Mm,
collective unconscious? Share it. That what would the purpose be of the self-disclosure? Um, if you're self-disclosing like unfinished business, probably not a good idea.
right, red flag.
There, there's also another kind of self-disclosure, I think, that's about sharing kind of how your experience is right now in this moment. Let's say as maybe
Mm,
somebody's talking about something difficult, you suspect there's shame, and as you're empathizing, you get a pit in your stomach to say, you know, Charlie or Leroy or Liliana or Ben, or as you talk, I don't know about you, but I got this pit in my stomach and my throat is
mm-hmm.
tightening. I wonder what's happening for you. Um, there's another kind of self-disclosure that isn't about content and stories that I believe is underutilized and under encouraged and under trained. Well,
Yeah,
thank
I
you.
actually really appreciate that.
We got to do this again.
Yes, yeah. Well, I was going to share a story of that very kind of
Oh,
self-disclosure
please.
where I had a client and we were doing some trauma work and they had panic attacks and things like that. And at one point they were doing something where there was no verbal interaction. They were actually like working through some bilateral stimulation.
Hmm.
And all of a sudden I had them pause and ask, what are you noticing? They're like, nothing. And I was like, really? Because I'm feeling like this choked feeling in my throat and tears are
Hmm.
coming to my eyes. And they looked at me and they're like, oh, Khara, those are my tears. I haven't cried in 2 years. I was just like,
We are
it was goosebumps
connected.
even saying that. Yeah, like it was so powerful. And for them to actually articulate that, it like unlocked something where we were able to keep going. But yeah, like that was a
And,
self-disclosure that in that moment felt like I needed to name it because it was there. It was in the
but
room.
look
It
how moving
felt.
that was for you.
Yeah.
And you're
Yeah.
surprised. These are your tears. We are connected by the heart. Where do you end and where do I start? You know, the central nervous system is an open system. The limbic system, Lewis et al., I think 2004, the beautiful language. The limbic system, the emotional brain of the social mammal, and particularly human, exists for the synchronous exchange of emotional states. You did the synchronous exchange that was moving for her. It allowed her to name it. It was moving to you.
Mm.
It's a dip. This emotional engagement. That'd be the last thing actually I forgot to talk about, which is emotional engagement in the work. I think a lot of burnout comes from resistance or
Mm.
resisting being emotionally engaged in the work. And the more I just
Hold,
let
hold, hold.
myself,
Yeah.
yep, the more I let myself feel what I feel while I'm in the room, in service of the couple, the family, the individual, the group, um, I get to relax and be more present. And I think you go back. That's the original roots of experiential therapies and humanistic therapies is be more fully present. And I think your work in the beginning, it'll be hard. You're going to get battered around and bruised and stuff. But I
Mm.
believe in the long term, it's a better way to be as a person and as a therapist.
It's beautiful. Well, Jim, I really appreciated having this conversation with you. I feel like you were the best person I could have even thought to
Oh,
ask these questions. So I really feel like there's a lot here to unpack if people probably need to watch this a couple times to get all the nuggets that you put in there. But thank you again for having the conversation. I'm hopeful it's going to help people show up more real, for lack of a better way to put it. Just be real.
thanks for inviting me and asking.
Yeah,
It's an
absolutely.
honor. Thank you.
Well, viewers, stay tuned for more videos. We'll see you next time.